Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. This is episode 31 of the Feeling Good podcast, and this is part 3 of the live session we did with our volunteer, Mark. It's a great session. And so this segment that we're about to hear is about agenda setting, and more specifically, paradoxical agenda setting. And one thing I wanted to say is that this came, especially for me, at a very serendipitous point, because I just finished reading your article in the Psychotherapy Networker. This is the March-April 2017 issue, where you wrote an article called When Helping Doesn't Help, which is really about this process. And I'll put a link in the show notes for that. Before we talk about this segment itself, I want to say a few words about the article.
Right. Well, I talk about it was a great opportunity that Rich Simon, the editor of Psychotherapy Networker, gave me to write this article. I was very humbled and honored to have that wonderful opportunity. And it's really about my own evolution as a therapist, how I started out with, cognitive behavior therapy in the early days and was incredibly excited about it. And I wrote Feeling Good, and that kind of helped to make cognitive therapy probably, I think it's the most widely used form of psychotherapy in the world now. When we first started out, there was only about 5 or 6 of us, and it was totally unknown. And the methods in cognitive therapy are really tremendous. And I had all kinds of patients who were responding fairly quickly. But I soon noticed that there were always those patients who resisted. And they would fight me and seemed like they weren't working with me. They weren't doing their homework, psychotherapy homework. And that bothered me, and I wanted to find out why is it that some people don't respond readily, and the research began to show the same thing, not only with cognitive therapy, but with every form of psychotherapy for depression, that about 50% of patients improve, but 50% do not. And I wanted to find out, what is it about those 50% of patients who aren't improving? Why do they get stuck in their symptoms? And I began to do research on that and develop clinical techniques to address it, and that's what has really led to the team CBT and the emphasis. What I discovered in my research and what I talk about in the article is that the missing component was motivation and resistance. And so we've taken a resistance revisited, beginning to look at this ancient notion, but in a radically new way. Yeah. And in the article, I discuss our new approach to resistance, and also describe a woman who had struggled with 30 years of violence and rape, horrific trauma, and failed therapy for depression, and how she recovered in a single therapy session, a 2-hour session.
Yeah, it's rather dramatic, yeah.
Yeah.
And all because of the way you address the resistance first and foremost.
Yeah, that's right. And this has been huge in therapy, and we're going to show how we do that here in the session with Mark as well, because usually we think about resistance as in a kind of negative terms. This is the way I was taught to think about it, that patients resist change because they're afraid of change, or they have a negative identity, that they don't want to give up their negative complaining self, or they kind of want to feel sorry for themselves, and all these formulations of resistance are a bit pejorative. They kind of putting the patient down, blaming them in a way, and seeing them as defective. And while there's truth in those kinds of formulations because, we all kind of like to feel sorry for ourselves sometimes. They're all very negative and not really helpful.
Yeah, there's it kind of tends to foster self-blame and things like this.
Yeah.
What's wrong with me?
Yeah, and the approach that I've developed for dealing with resistance is the diametrically the opposite, and it's a shock to clinicians, it's a shock to patients, but we've discovered that your worst symptoms of shame, inadequacy, defectiveness, like what Mark is feeling, and depression and anger and anxiety and hopelessness and inferiority, all of these symptoms are actually, in most cases, revealing really fantastic, beautiful things about the person. That these are a reflection of the patient's inner core values. And the paradox is that when you make the patient proud of their symptoms, rather than feeling it's some defect, but it's really a manifestation of the very best part of their soul and their character.
I would say values also, don't
their values,
you say? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And then the paradoxically, once they become proud of their symptoms, the resistance disappears. And they are suddenly eager to work with you, and they don't yes but you anymore. And when you get them to that level, then significant or complete recovery, complete elimination of symptoms is usually just a stone's throw away, in the sense of, maybe 15 or 20 minutes more work, you suddenly see the symptoms disappear.
One thing I want to say for our listeners is that we decided to split the segment into two portions. So you will be going through the initial stages of the paradoxical agenda setting, and before we hear Mark coming up with those very positive aspects of himself and the way you help him through that, we're going to be ending the segment and give our listeners a chance to do that exercise for themselves. And then in the next podcast, they'll get to hear the answer and then the rest of the agenda setting.
Absolutely. So I hope you do try the written exercise we suggest, because it can really be life-changing, whether you're a therapist or an individual struggling with depression and anxiety. It's going to transform your way of thinking about psychological or psychiatric symptoms. I also want to mention that in this paradoxical agenda setting segment, we're going to be going over 6 techniques, and I'll just...
let's mention those, yes.
The first is called the invitation step. And by the way,
usually number one,
I'll make these sound simple, but they're actually require quite a bit of training to learn how to do skillfully, but I'll make them seem simple. The invitation step is what we start out, asking the patient, after you've empathized, is there something here that you'd want to work on? And if so, would this be a good time to roll up our sleeves and get to work? Or do you need more time to talk and vent, because support is important, and I don't want to jump in, before you're ready.
I'd like to make a point here, which is what you just said sounds like fairly natural. But one thing that's very important is you really give the patient the sense that they could work on it, or they could, express themselves somewhere. Either way was fine with you. There was no pressure to go in any particular direction.
Yes, exactly. The next thing you do in paradoxical agenda setting is called specificity. And this is unique to team CBT and quite different from many schools of therapy. We ask the client or patient, whatever word you want, to focus on just one moment you were upset that you want help with. And the idea is that all of the patient's problems will be encapsulated in that one moment. And for Mark, the one moment is simply sitting there in the session with Jill and David, reflecting on his life as a father, and reflecting on his failures to get close to his son, and then he recorded all of his negative feelings that he was having right there in the session, and his negative thoughts as well.
Yeah, we should probably at some point do a podcast on each of those agenda setting techniques, because they each have a lot of subtleties in there which may not be apparent right now.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That would be a great idea. Then, since Mark has said yes, he does want help with this problem with his son feeling like a failure, unable to get close to his son, we asked the miracle cure question. Yeah. And that's Mark, what kind of help would you be looking for? Let's say a miracle happens in today's session. At the end of the session, you walk out and say, "Wow, that was a life-changing experience." What would change for you? What are you hoping for? And you'll hear him saying that what he would love to have happen is for all these negative thoughts and feelings disappear. His shame, his depression, his anger, his frustration, his hopelessness, his defectiveness. And then you're going to hear something called the magic button. And we say, well, Mark, let's imagine there's a magic button right here, and if you press it, all these negative feelings and negative thoughts will instantly vanish like in a miracle, and you'll be euphoric. And it'll take no effort. Just press this button, and you'll be cured.
There's a lot of mystical elements in this. It's interesting because in the Psychotherapy Network, in the same issue, the next article after yours is called "How's Psychotherapy Lost Its Magic?"
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Well, we're bringing the magic back. I didn't read that one, but that sounds great too. And so, would you press this magic button? And he says, well, yes, of course I would press it. And you hear that from almost every patient. People want to feel better because they've been told that their symptoms are bad. Yeah. And you press this magic button, and then you'll be happy. And then the paradox continues, because then, and this is the exercise we'll have the listeners do. We say, well, we don't have a magic button, but we've got some pretty good techniques, and there's a good chance that will happen before the end of the session. In fact, I predict it probably will. I can't guarantee it, but I suspect that is going to happen. But before we do that, we maybe better decide whether or not that's a good idea. And this now I'm becoming paradoxical, and I'm giving up my role as the helper, and I'm going to become his resistance. And I'm saying, but before we press that magic button, maybe we better make a list of what these negative thoughts and feelings show about you that's beautiful and awesome, as well as some benefits to you in having these negative thoughts and feelings. And I think then that's the exercise we're going to have the listeners do, see what you can come up with. And you'll probably struggle with it. And if you have trouble with it, this exercise, that's whether you're a therapist or general public type person, patient, whatever, that's really good if it's hard for you, because once then we do it, it's going to become so obvious to you. Yeah. And that is going to create new networks in your brain. You're going to learn something that you didn't understand before. And so then after that, after this positive reframing, we're going to come up with a list with 10, 15, 20 or so beautiful things that all of these so-called problems reveal about Mark. And then at the end, we're going to say, well, we're going to do a technique called the acid test. And that's kind of like, well, so you want to be happy today, and press the magic button, but you'd still have a bad relationship with your son. Would you want to be happy in spite of having? That's right. You see, and so began to make it clear to him why he's clinging to his negative symptoms. And then we show all the beautiful things it shows about him, and then we end with something called the magic dial.
More magic. Yeah,
more magic. That's right. Instead of pressing this button and having everything disappear, maybe we could, reduce these symptoms to some healthy level. Like, what would be an appropriate amount of sadness? When you can't get close to your oldest son, it's 60% now. what would you like it to be at the end of the session, this type of thing. And then we have him use the goal column, which I'll reveal to you in the next episode. I'll post it, and you can see what his goals are. And so then that's the end of the paradoxical agenda setting. And so now his goals are not to make all the symptoms disappear, but to reduce them to an ideal level.
Yeah, that's a very, very good description of how this segment goes. So
there's one last thing that I want to say. Maybe we'll bring this out next time. But the goal column itself is an illusion. See, we're making a deal with his subconscious mind.
Don't tell everyone.
I shouldn't, because you see, what we put him in control and say, you don't have to get rid of these symptoms completely. You can save face. Your subconscious resistance can save face and only lower it to a certain level. But then once we get into the methods part of the section and we start blowing his negative thoughts out of the water, it's very likely that his goals will then change and he may overshoot his goals.
So Jill, tell me a little bit about this agenda setting part and getting into it and the paradoxicality of it.
Sure. I think that agenda setting, when I first learned cognitive behavioral therapy, the concept of agenda setting actually meant that you sat down with a patient in the beginning of a session and you said, what's the agenda for today? Like kind of what are we going to talk about today?
That's what most people understand.
Exactly. That's what the average therapist would think agenda setting means, setting an agenda at the beginning of every session, which I think is a valuable activity. But it's not what we're talking about here. Actually, agenda setting is like a process of getting on the same page with the patient. It's making sure that it's a number of different steps, right? We have 5 steps of agenda setting that we teach to therapists. Essentially, in summary, it's making sure that you and the patient are both accountable for what you're working on, for picking something specific to work on, even getting very specific in terms of a moment in time, which you'll see that we did with Mark. And then the paradoxical agenda setting is about siding with the patient's resistance or good reasons not to change, which we find that when we do authentically and we take plenty of time to do, the patient quite often will paradoxically then kind of argue for change. That if we can side with the voice of the resistance, it actually encourages the patient to step on the other side and argue for change.
One thing I noticed, Jill, is that you started, if I remember correctly, with the miracle cure. There's a lot of magical terms in
right.
Team CBT. Can you say a little bit more about what you did with Mark in terms of the miracle cure?
Yeah, actually, after doing some agenda setting with Mark, where we had listed what were all the good reasons for his symptoms and what were some really beautiful things that his symptoms said about him, he was almost a little bit on the fence, right? These sounded like really some like good advantages and good reasons to continue to feel sad and guilty and to blame himself. And so part of what I was asking him there was the miracle cure question, which is, Mark, if you could get just what you wanted out of our work together, if a miracle could happen and you could walk out of here and something would change, what would that be? And that's really to help the patient to get very clear about what they're hoping to get out of therapy. And it's also keeps the therapist from, again, working on something that the patient actually doesn't want help with. We're turning the control over the patient to say, what is it that you most want to get out of our work together?
And that's when we learned that what he wanted was to really accept the relationship with his son the way it is and to not feel inadequate about it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit about the acid test and magic button and the acid test?
Sure. I think David got us started with this in the session with Mark, and we said to Mark, if you could press a magic button and you could walk out of this office or this session feeling joy and self-esteem, and you wouldn't have any of these negative thoughts and feelings, would you press that button? And most patients will say, yes, of course, that's, kind of why I came here. And then we follow that with saying, something along the lines of, absolutely, I'd love to bring those positive feelings to you, but at the same time, I can think of some reasons, maybe to hold on to these symptoms, or some advantages of your shame or your guilt, or some things that your shame or guilt say about you that are really positive or beautiful. And then we take, as you see in the session, a lot of time to explore the positive value of the patient's symptoms.
I noticed you really put a lot of time into that, because in the first pass, you and David and Mark came up with a good dozen reasons for those, positive reasons for those emotions.
Absolutely. Right. And the idea here is that, David uses the lingo that we are kind of making a deal with the patient's subconscious mind. It's sort of the idea that if we didn't honor the positive value of these symptoms, and we just kind of went from empathy to methods and had the patient kind of challenge all these negative thoughts, quite often we'll hit resistance. The patient will be yes-butting you, or not completely recovering or being able to talk back to their negative thoughts. But if we actually take the time to really kind of honor the reasons not to change, honor the value of the symptoms, and allow the patient, as you saw with the magic dial, we're kind of making a compromise. We're saying, could we come up with a way of dialing down your negative feelings so that you can hang on to some of these advantages, and yet still reduce the suffering? And I think going through that process with the patient really allows them to feel motivated to change and to not worry about holding on to the advantages.
Well, unless there's something else you needed to add, let's listen to that part of the segment.
Thank you, Fabrice.
Okay.
Well, I'm wondering, should we see if it's time to move on to some paradoxical agenda? Have we done well enough on the empathy? Did we want to see if the tears would flow more,
Yeah, since this is decades long emotional issue for me, so I have had time to basically come to acceptance. It is not taking the sadness away, but that's, for me, that's what it is.
But Mark, if we could, if kind of a miracle could happen today, and you could walk out of our session and something would be different, is there still something you'd want our help with? Because I kind of heard you say, I feel like I've moved to acceptance. So now I'm wondering, is there actually, you came here wanting some help with feelings of sadness and guilt and shame around your relationship with your son? Is that still something you'd want some help with?
Yeah, I think all of these feelings, some of them at really high scores, I just live with them. I have accepted that I'm living with all of these. Mm-hmm. And
so should we just leave them alone, or do you want our help in seeing if you'd actually be able to feel some relief from these?
What I have learned is that these feelings are not necessarily in a stone. They can change. Mm-hmm. And if there is any way to even decrease this, it would be extremely valuable for me. Yeah, I don't know. I have not found a way to do it myself as much as I come to your classes and listen to you guys. I haven't been able to accomplish that.
Okay.
Well, suppose that today's session is really, really a great one, and you walk out at noon or whenever you finish up and just say that was really tremendous. That was a life-changing experience. What would happen here if we could work some kind of miracle?
I would be able to accept my relationship with my son as is, not feel so highly sad, anxious, feel inadequate, basically lifelong failure about it.
Well, let me ask you a question. Suppose there was a magic button here, and if you pressed it, all these negative thoughts and feelings, and the guilt and the shame and the failure and the anxiety and the sadness and inadequacy and defectiveness would diminish dramatically or even disappear, and you would walk out of today's session and drive home with a real sense of joy and self-esteem and relief. Would you press that button?
Yeah, that would be great. I would drive back home feeling born again.
Yeah, okay. Well, we can't promise that result. We've got some wonderful tools, as you know, and there's a good chance that will happen. But I'm not so sure that's necessarily a good idea. Before we press that magic button, maybe we should ask two questions about all of your negative thoughts and feelings. One would be, what are some benefits to you in having these negative thoughts and feelings? And we'll get more negative thoughts in a minute, because I'm sure there's more than those three. But what are some benefits, some advantages to you? That's question number one. And question number two is, what do these negative thoughts and feelings show about you that's really awesome and positive? You're thinking about all of this as revealing your defectiveness, and you're wanting to be healed from your defectiveness, a healing that you've been looking for your entire life, and it's been elusive to you. Mm-hmm. And what I'm suggesting here is, what do all these feelings of defectiveness and shame, and self-criticism show about you that's really something kind of special? And one way to do that is, maybe we could just together see if we could make a list of some of the positives and the benefits of these negative thoughts and feelings. Does that make sense?
Yep. Does that make sense to you, Mark?
Yes, but I'm not sure what good can come from all of these.
That's why people get stuck in them, because we think of them as bad. Yes. And we fight against them, and that's the way society is set up. That we tell people, you have this mental disorder or something, like you have a major depressive disorder, and that's caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, or you say some defect in your brain, and we're struggling generally with a sense of discouragement and hopelessness to try to correct this defect. And I'm saying, let's look at it from a radically different perspective and see what we can come up with. And let's just start with something here. The chief complaint, the guilt. Mm-hmm. Does that say ashamed?
Ashamed and remorseful.
Yeah. And that's, what degree is that? 60%.
60.
So there's a tremendous degree of shame there. What is your guilt and shame and remorse show about you that's really pretty awesome, pretty beautiful, pretty fantastic? I don't mean to sound over the top, but does anything come to mind?
That,
in fact, people who are listening to the podcast, you might just want to, I don't want to turn this into a gimmick, but you might just want to turn off the podcast for a moment and see if you can write down on a piece of paper, put the word positives at the top of the piece of paper, and see if you can write down some really awesome things about Mark that are revealed by all these negative thoughts and feelings, starting out with the guilt and shame.
So now we have a little bit of a cliffhanger, and we're asking our listeners to do this homework on their own. And since Team CBT is very much homework-oriented, I think this is quite appropriate. Any suggestion you'd like to make to the listeners for them to do this list of positive attributes?
No, I just say dive in and do it. And again, if it's hard for you, that's cool. The secret will be revealed in the next podcast. And you might be asking yourself too, I mean, do you sometimes feel inadequate or ashamed? I know I sometimes feel that way. And so as you begin to say, what do these negative thoughts and feelings reveal about Mark that's so beautiful and awesome? And I think you're going to be very touched when you hear it, that you may also begin to think, what is beautiful and awesome about your depression, and what are benefits of your hopelessness, what are some great things that your self-criticisms show about you, because that's going to be my next move with my career is to bring these things to the general public in some way, just as when I wrote Feeling Good brought the cognitive therapy to the world. I want to bring this fabulous new breakthrough to the world as well.
I think that's a great service. And I wanted to add that I'm not going to leave our listeners hanging for too long. Instead of publishing the next podcast next week, so I will do that the next day. So they have overnight to think about it.
Right.
And then they'll get the solution in the morning.
Yes, great. Perfect.
All right, very good, David. Thank you. This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.